Exchequer, former Foreign Secretary, and former Prime Minister, Sir John Major. Before Sir John steps out, I just want to say that the occasion of this event, very appropriately held in a place like this, is Sir John's publication of this book, My Old Man, which is a history of the music hall in Britain, and which he describes in the book as being a labour of love. It is a labour of love. It's an absolutely wonderful book. That's what I'm really enjoyable, and that's what we're going to be talking about. Now, before Sir John comes on, I just want to say that he and I will be discussing for about 35 minutes, 40 minutes, and then we'll be going to be opening it up to the floor. We'll bring up the house lights, there'll be a couple of microphones, and you can also add your questions to the questions that I've been asking, and we can all get stuck in. Then after that, there will be a book signing by Sir John up here on the stage, so those who will want to be here for that, and I would recommend that a lot of you are, can stay behind for that, and they can have the book signed up on the stage. Well, that's enough of the housekeeping. Could you please put your hands together to welcome onto the stage Sir John Major. What did you guys get applauded like that?
It's the first time for everything.
It was famously said about Sir John that he was the one boy in British history who ran away from the circus to join the bank. I discovered this when I, for the first night of Channel 5, made a comparative film biography of Sir John and Tony Blair, and discovered that Sir John's background was so much more interesting than Tony Blair's. I'm not saying anything rude about Tony Blair here at all, but it just is a fact that what we were discovering about Sir John's background was exceptionally interesting, and very, very unusual. So I'm going to invite you to step back into that, Sir John, when I ask you how you came to write a book. Sir John Major, former Prime Minister of this country, how you came to write a book on the history of music hall.
Let me try and set that out clearly. There's a flippant answer and there's a true answer. The true answer is that my father was in his mid-60s when I was born. My father was 65, my mother was surprised. And he was 65 when I was born. And in his early 70s, this proud, independent, Victorian man lost all his money in a business venture and then began to lose his sight and his health. And we had moved from our home to 2 rooms in Brixton in a rather large, multi-occupied, multi-racial house. And we had 2 rooms at the top for the whole family. And my father was bedridden in his early 70s, and I was just still a youngster. And that was very frustrating for him. And he sat in bed, this active man, thinking of his life and looking back on it. And the happiest time of his life was the period between 1900 and 1930 when he was a music hall performer. And I became his audience. He would sit there, and he was a wonderful raconteur. He talked to me about the people he worked with, Murray Lloyd, Dan Leno, Gertie Katana, all sorts of people, including strange things like Prago the Missing Link, who was also on I think I met him actually, in my previous profession. And he was talking about that, and there was this small boy lapping it up and learning what life was like in the Victorian and Edwardian era for people who were on stage. And it sank deep into the psyche, what he said and what I learned. And it has been with me all my life. And I suppose writing this book is for my parents, for Tom and Gwen. It's a last encore for their time on the stage, and that's why it was a labour of love.
When your father was in that situation, in bed in those 2 rooms up in Brixton. He was visited, wasn't he, by these characters. Can you tell us something about them?
Well, there were quite a lot of them. I can't remember how many, but quite a few. And people the same sort of vintage as my father, or sometimes a little older, sometimes a little younger. And they were rather shabbily dressed. If prosperity had ever touched them, it had long since left them. And they came to see my father, and they had performed with him on stage 50 or 60 years ago, and they'd heard that he was ill. And they'd come to see him. Some of them had been in his shows. And they came up to see him, and they drank whatever whiskey they made in the house. That didn't last long, there wasn't much. We then turned to tea, which I served. And they then talked. And they talked about those times 50, 60 years earlier, when they'd appeared on stage. And it was evident listening to them that whatever had happened in their life, those were the golden moments when they were on stage entertaining. Some were good, some were talented, some were not good, some were untalented. They tried to sing again, they tried to do their old tricks. Some of them tried to do acrobatics as they'd done half a century before, and with mixed results. There was one lady I remember who tried to spin a saucer on her finger. Fortunately, we had enough to buy new saucers, and it wasn't too much of a disaster. But they came alive, and I saw whatever hardship had touched them, those days when they had worked with their peers on the stage in that lost art of musical, were the days they most enjoyed. And actually, when my father lay dying, I was one side of the bed, and my mother, who had been in his shows towards the end, she had been a young dancer in his show, was holding his hand the other side of the bed. And as he died, he died very peacefully. And over several hours, he gently faded away. And in that time, smiles kept crossing his face. And we knew where he was. He was back on the stage, where he had been half a century earlier. And he died, I think, a happy man, with the happiest of memories of that time. And as you get older, I think you see some things in better context. You can look back at your parents and you can see them more clearly than you could at the time. And as I have got older, the need to write this book has grown. And I'm sorry, I finished it. It was enormous fun to do. It's like losing an old friend now. But that was the real impetus that made me write.
I'd like to have been there when your agent phoned the first publisher telling them what they had on offer. Since they didn't know all this. Yeah, and he wants to write what? That would have been interesting. Since you've pointed it out, Sir John, tell me what you discovered, and us what you discovered about what your father's act was. What did it, the things he was remembering doing, what was he actually remembering, and what had he done?
Well, his act changed. When he lived in America, he was a trapeze artist, and they thought he had a heart murmur, which actually turns out was nothing serious at all. But he gave that up, and he came back from the United States. He was English, but he'd been in the United States. He came back, and for a reason I don't quite know, he went into show business. And originally, he played with batons, he did tumbling acts and acrobats. He met Kitty Grant, who was a fellow performer, and they formed a double act. Originally, it was singing and comedy. And that developed and embraced all sorts of things like magic tricks. And then, round about 1910, they formed their own show, and they wrote what today we would call reviews. And Dad employed a small company of between 15 and 30 at any one time. And they put on sketches, most of which I think Kitty wrote. And they'd have comedy sketches, they'd have singing, they'd have monologues, which Kitty certainly wrote. And they would have their shows after the Overture, Ginger, a whole range of them. And they would tour the country with them, probably for months on end at a time, and then they would do something else, and then maybe they revive the show again in the pre-television, pre-radio era. who needed much less material than comedians and singers do today. And that's what he did. And he was back in that time when he was dying.
What would a show, do we know what a show would have consisted of? If we had, well, let's imagine that this is the theatre your father is going to open. Let's suppose we're when would you like to be, 1910 or something like that? What would this audience, what would we have come into, and what would we actually see happening?
Let's go back a bit before 1910, because it's much more interesting. The earlier days are much more interesting than later. By 1910, you had great big theatres like the Palladium, and the old music hall artists said, well, performing at the Palladium is like spitting into a canyon. and by then they had microphones, which was alien to their tradition.
They had microphones in 1910?
Yeah, they began to get early microphones in 1910. But in the earlier days, what would the show have consisted of? Well, the staple part would have been a so-called lion comique or serio comédienne, who would sing comic songs of one sort or another. The great experiments, George Leyburn, for example, and Marie Lloyd just a little later. There would be straightforward comedians who would be there. There would almost undoubtedly be a magician. There were a vast range of magicians, some of them total charlatans, absolute charlatans. There was a guy called Washington Bishop, who was occasionally being sued and fleeing the country to avoid paying the libel damages. And when Washington Bishop died, he had left a will saying his body parts should be used for science in some way. And so he died, and the body parts were duly removed. And the very next day, his mother appeared and said, this was very unfortunate because he wasn't dead. he actually suffered from blackouts, and he wasn't really dead, and she wanted the doctors arrested. So they did a second autopsy. And amongst the other absurdities, they found his brain in his chest cavity. Anyway, the doctors were exonerated. So you'd have had magicians, most certainly. You'd have had all sorts of variety. You might have had the Lady Baritone, for example.
A lady baritone?
A lady baritone. You might have had the talking duck. you might have had Leotard, the trapeze artist, who would have his trapeze strung up over the audience and would swing on top of the audience.
So you'd look up if you were in the audience.
And he would be above you swinging, that's right. I mean, the song, The Daring Young Man on the Flying Trapeze, was written by Leotard and sung by George Leyburn, exactly for that reason. You'd have all sorts of curious trick cycling. After the cycle was invented about the 1870s, you'd have trick cycling acts. So that would be the sort of composition you would have. And none of the acts would be very long. You might have 20 or more acts on the evening.
20?
Absolutely. And most of the artists would appear for quite a short time. They got through their careers with a handful of songs. I mean, George Coburn, one of the greatest of music hall artists, effectively in a 50-year career had 2 songs. Two Lovely Black Eyes and The Man Who Broke the Bank in Monte Carlo.
What songs?
Oh, great songs. Great. He's an amazing man, actually. He lived into the 1940s. And when he was 92, he went to a funeral with Tommy Trinder. And they were leaving the cemetery. And Trinder turned round to Charlie Coburn and said, "How old are you, Charlie?" And Charlie puffed himself up proudly and said, 92. And Trinder said, 92, Charlie. Do you think it's worth going home?
So you have up to 20 performers, all on, presumably on a long bill, which you know before, and you have your headliners, who are the Marie Lloyds and
The Dan Lenos, the Little Titches, the George Leyburns. And you had lots of people just below them, like Herbert Campbell, for example. Great big, think Fred Endy. And you have Campbell, a great pantomime artist who used to appear with Tiny Dan Leno, and they played the Baron and the Baron's wife, the King and the Queen, in alternative pantomimes. And there were some wonderful pantos in the 1890s, which had Leno, Campbell, Marie Lloyd, and sometimes Little Titch as well. Astonishing cast
Tell me about Little Titch, because, I mean, because in your book, Little Titch is the character I've never really heard of. You've heard of some of these others. They get referred to every now and again, and certainly were in my childhood on Radio 2 and so on. But Little Titch was something I've never heard of.
Well, Little Titch was a genius. Little Titch was the 15th son of a 77-year-old blacksmith. And he was born deformed. He had 6 fingers on his hands, and he only ever grew to 4 foot 6 inches tall. But he was a very clever, sensitive man. He was called Little Titch, but at age 10 he was doing very well at school. His father took him out of school because he had to go out and earn some money. 15 mouths to feed, everybody had to contribute. And so he did. And he was called Little Titch, bringing a new name into the English language, after Arthur Orton, the famous Titchborne claimant, who was a big fat man, very famous case at the time. And little Harry Ralph was so tiny, they began to call him Little Titch, and it stuck. And he was, as a performer, he was a genius. But so sensitive, he was never really recognised as a genius by the authorities in England. Snobbishness, I think, got in the way. But in France, he was given all sorts of awards, and many of his mannerisms and many of the mannerisms of Dan Leno were the sort of thing that the great Charlie Chaplin picked up and developed. So Titch was among the half-dozen greatest musical performers. Well, he was a comedian, really, but he could sing. Despite being such a tiny man at 4 foot 6, he had a deep baritone voice, even deeper than Gertie Cottin, the lady baritone. And he would sing well, but he was also predominantly a comedian. And he developed a particular act with big boots. He had some boots made that were 2 foot long, and he would lean forward on them, bend right over, and pick up a hat, putting it on his head, and lean back. And his big boots dance, which you can still see if you turn on the internet. There's some film of it in the early 20th century. It was an absolute sensation. No one had ever seen anything like it before. And again, if you want a lineal descendant, can't see from here, but I guess there are a few people here who remember Max Wall. Yeah, good, excellent, excellent. I feel among my age group. And of course, Max Wall was a lineal descendant, just like the Goons and Rowan Atkinson are lineal descendants of Dan Leno with his same years.
The other sort of performers which were interesting me a lot in your book, were something that died out entirely, were female impersonators. In other words, women who played men, and of course, we have a long tradition of men playing women, and that for some reason is kind of very widespread and acceptable. It's gone right the way up until the modern day. Female impersonators, we don't have anymore. What was that about?
Well, it started in the Northwest, round about the 1850s. The first of them was a lady not really remembered now, called Annie Hindley. She was followed by Ella Vesna, an American girl. And then there were a whole range of them, Fanny Rabina, and then some very famous ones indeed. The most famous of all was Vesta Tilley, who was quite supreme. Vesta Tilley began male impersonation at the age of 8. She had a very ambitious father, and it is probable that he saw a niche in the market and dressed this little girl as a man aged 8. And she appeared in pantomimes in feminine guise, but as she became an adult from the age of 17 onwards, she was completely a male impersonator and completely brilliant at it. And many of her songs, Burlington Bertie, of course, The Army of Today's All Right, which was used as a recruiting song in the First World War. And many people joined, and she had a stellar. She was one of the artists who never had a breath of scandal. And she retired, as all good artists should, having married a Conservative MP who became a peer of the realm. Retired, actually became a knight, not a peer, and retired to Monte Carlo with her earnings as Lady de Vries.
Having sung about Monte Carlo, she retired to Monte Carlo.
She sent up the swells, if I might use that old-fashioned term, for 50 years, and then became part of the establishment.